When Isabella Rossetti, the world's most arrogant violinist, she had no idea she was about to witness a miracle that would shatter everything she believed about faith, art, and the quiet power hiding beneath papal robes. The sun had just begun to rise over the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, casting a warm golden hue across the cobblestones of Vatican City. The air was filled with a sense of wonder, as pilgrims, priests, reporters, and cardinals from around the world gathered in the square below. Pope Leo XIV emerged onto the balcony for morning prayers, his face calm and serene as he raised his hand in blessing, whispering to the world what seemed like peace, be still. To those who knew him, Robert Francis Castellano had always been a man of deep humility, a quiet scholar from the south side of Chicago who had spent most of his priesthood serving forgotten communities in the mountains of Bolivia. Through the ranks of the church had been marked not by political maneuvering, but by quiet conviction, unwavering orthodoxy, and a heart that seemed to understand suffering in ways that touched even the most cynical observers. But there were things about Pope Leo XIV that the world didn't know, things that would have surprised even the cardinals who had elected him. In the small apartment above his father's music shop on Helsted Street, young Roberto had learned that beauty was a form of prayer, that melody was a language God understood better than Latin, that silence between notes could hold more truth than 1,000 sermons. 3 weeks after his election, as the Vatican settled into its new rhythm, Pope Leo XIV announced a series of cultural initiatives aimed at restoring the Church's ancient dialogue with beauty and creativity. The first event would be held in the Paul VI audience hall, an evening of sacred music and reflection. Designed to showcase the harmony between faith and art, the announcement caused a ripple of curiosity throughout. Rome's artistic circles, Vatican officials, musicians, theologians, and journalists wondered what direction this unexpected American pope would take. When the invitation was extended to Europe's most renowned musicians, one name stood above all others: Isabella Rossetti, a child prodigy who had become one of the most celebrated violinists in the world, and also one of its most vocal atheists. As Cardinal Torretti reviewed the guest list that morning, he felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. Inviting Isabella Rossetti to perform at the Vatican was either brilliantly bold or dangerously naive. What none of them could have imagined was what would happen when sacred ground met secular genius. Cardinal Torretti's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the phone in his modest Vatican office. The morning light streaming through ancient windows, casting shadows across the stack of concert programs spread before him. The Pope's vision for cultural outreach was bold, perhaps too bold, and the Cardinal knew that the success or failure of this initiative would rest heavily on his shoulders. "Maestro Benedetti," he said into the receiver, his voice carrying the careful diplomacy of a man walking a tightrope. "This is Cardinal Torretti from the Vatican. His Holiness Pope Leo XIV would like to extend a personal invitation." The conversations had been going on for hours. Some musicians responded with reverent enthusiasm, others with polite curiosity, and a few with barely concealed skepticism. But there was one name on the list that made every other call seem like a warm-up exercise: Isabella Rossetti. Monsignor Albani, the Vatican's cultural advisor, shifted nervously in his chair. "Your Eminence," he said, adjusting his glasses, "perhaps we should reconsider. Miss Rossetti is ... complicated. Her talent is undeniable. But her public statements about the Church are exactly why the Holy Father wants her here." Cardinal Torretti replied, though his own doubts echoed loudly in the silence between words. He had spent the previous evening reading reviews of Isabella's performances. Critics called her transcendent, otherworldly, and touched by something beyond human understanding. The irony that such language was used to describe someone who publicly denied the divine was not lost on him. Isabella Rossetti had debuted at La Scala at age 14, playing Paganini's Caprice, No. 24, with such technical mastery and emotional depth that seasoned musicians wept. By 25, she had performed with every major orchestra in Europe. By 30, she was considered the finest violinist of her generation. Now, at 34, she was a cultural icon whose concerts sold out within minutes of tickets going. On sale, she commands fees that would fund a small parish for a year. Monsignor Albani continued, his voice heavy with concern. And she's known to be ... unpredictable. Remember the incident in Vienna, when she stopped mid-performance to lecture the audience about the mythology of religion? Cardinal Toretti nodded grimly. That same incident had made international headlines, but it had also demonstrated something that gave him hope. Isabella Rossetti was a woman searching for truth, even if she didn't recognize it. Her music spoke of longing, of questions that talent alone couldn't answer. The Holy Father believes, Cardinal Toretti said quietly, that sometimes the most lost sheep make the most beautiful music when they finally come home. He picked up the phone again, knowing this next call would change everything. Isabella Rossetti's penthouse apartment commanded a perfect view of La Scala's neoclassical façade, its columns standing like sentinels over Milan's cultural heart. From her floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the very stage where she had conquered the world's most demanding audiences, where critics had proclaimed her the voice of angels through horsehair and wood. The irony of that phrase had always amused her angels. Indeed, when she knew there was nothing beyond the material world but silence and decay. The Vatican. Isabella's laugh was sharp as crystal, cutting through the morning air as she held the invitation in her manicured fingers. Pope Leo XIV wants me to play in his little cultural circus. Marco Santini, her agent of 12 years, watched nervously from the Italian leather sofa. He had seen Isabella in many moods, furious after a critic's negative review, euphoric after a flawless performance, coldly calculating when negotiating contracts. But this particular combination of amusement and contempt made him uneasy. Fee they're offering is substantial, Marco ventured, adjusting his silk tie, and the exposure would be unprecedented. Every major network would cover. I don't need their money, Isabella interrupted, setting down the invitation and moving to her violin case. The instrument inside was a 1734 Guarneri del Gesù, worth more than most people's homes. She lifted it with a reverence others might reserve for sacred relics, though she would have laughed at the comparison. This is my God, Marco. This is my religion. Everything else is mythology for the weak-minded. Yet even as she spoke, something stirred beneath her carefully constructed cynicism. The invitation itself was handwritten, personal rather than official, and there was something about the wording to share in the eternal dialogue between beauty and truth that struck her as unexpectedly sophisticated for a religious institution she viewed as backward. He's supposed to be different, this Pope, Marco said carefully. Isabella drew her bow across the strings, producing a single piercing note that hung in the air like a challenge. Then perhaps it's time someone reminded the modern world what the Church really represents: superstition, dressed up in pretty robes and ancient rituals. A slow smile spread across her face, the kind that had preceded some of her most devastating performance reviews and cutting interviews. She had built her career not just on technical brilliance, but on fearless honesty, on her willingness to strip away pretense and reveal uncomfortable truths. "Accept the invitation," she said, her voice carrying the same precision she brought to Paganini's most difficult passages. "But make it clear I'm not coming to honor their faith. I'm coming to show the world what real transcendence looks like." The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake both their worlds. The Vatican archives held secrets that stretched back centuries, but in the quiet of his private study, Pope Leo XIV found himself wrestling with doubts far more immediate than ancient mysteries. The leather-bound volumes surrounding him contained the accumulated wisdom of saints and scholars, yet none offered guidance for the path he was about to walk, inviting the secular world into sacred space, risking everything on the belief that beauty could bridge what doctrine sometimes divided. He sat alone in the lamplight, his fingers tracing the spine of a worn book that few would expect to find in a papal study. The Life and Works of Paganini. Beside it lay volumes on Bach's sacred compositions, Vivaldi's religious concertos, and hidden beneath a stack of theological treatises detailed analyses of modern virtuoso techniques. These were not the academic interests of a casual observer, but the careful studies of someone who understood music from the inside out. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Your Holiness?" Father Santos, his private secretary, peered through the doorway. "Cardinal Toretti is here with updates on the cultural initiative." "One moment," Pope Leo XIV replied, quickly closing the Paganini biography and sliding it beneath the theological texts. Old habits died hard, even for a pope. The boy from Chicago, who had spent countless hours practicing scales in his father's music shop, had learned early to hide his passion from those who might not understand, as Father Santos withdrew. The Pope opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small, weathered photograph of his father, Giuseppe Castellano, standing proudly beside a young Roberto at an old upright piano. Giuseppe's calloused hands, scarred from years of violin repair, rested gently on his son's shoulders. Music is prayer made audible, his father had whispered on countless evenings. When you play with your heart, mio figlio, God listens with his. Pope Leo XIV wondered if his father's faith in music's sacred power had been naive optimism or prophetic wisdom. Isabella Rossetti was coming brilliant, beautiful, and utterly convinced that art existed in a realm untouched by the divine. She would arrive expecting to find a sheltered religious leader who understood scripture but knew nothing of the language she spoke most fluently. He opened the Paganini book again, studying the technical notations he had made in the margins years. AGO. His fingers unconsciously moved across his desk, as if finding familiar positions on invisible strings. Perhaps it was time for both of them to discover that some conversations could only happen when souls met through music. The confrontation Cardinal Torretti was about to announce would test more than diplomatic protocol. It would reveal whether Grace could speak in a language the secular world would recognize. The black Mercedes pulled through the Vatican gates like a sleek predator entering a sanctuary, its tinted windows reflecting the ancient stones and Renaissance facades that had witnessed centuries of pilgrimage. Inside, Isabella Rossetti adjusted her Hermes scarf and checked her reflection one final time. Sharp cheekbones, eyes like polished steel, every detail calculated to project confidence that bordered on contempt. Cardinal Torretti waited at the entrance to the Paul VI audience hall, his red zucchetto catching the afternoon light as he smoothed his cassock nervously. Around him, Vatican staff bustled with final preparations, adjusting microphones, positioning cameras, arranging flowers that seemed almost apologetic in their attempts to soften the hall's stark modernist lines. "Miss Rossetti," the Cardinal said as she emerged from the car, violin case in hand. "Welcome to the Vatican. His Holiness Pope Leo XIV is honored by your presence." Isabella's smile was precision itself, warm enough to avoid outright rudeness, cold enough to establish hierarchy. "Cardinal," she replied, her Italian flawless but deliberately formal. "I must say, this is not what I expected." Her gaze swept across the hall's brutalist architecture with barely concealed distaste. "Where are the cherubs and gilded saints? I thought the Church preferred its art more traditional." The Paul VI audience hall represents the Church's embrace of modern expression. Cardinal Torretti replied carefully, noting how Isabella's eyes lingered dismissively on the controversial sculpture behind the altare, twisted bronze figure that critics had long debated as either profoundly spiritual or disturbingly abstract. "How wonderfully progressive," Isabella murmured, her tone suggesting anything but admiration. She opened her violin case with the reverence others might reserve for handling sacred relics, revealing the lustrous wood of her Guarneri del Gesù. The instrument caught the light like amber, its varnish deepened by nearly 3 centuries of music-making. Et sense, worth more than most Vatican art, I'd imagine. At least this has proven its value through centuries of human achievement rather than faith. The staff members nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Isabella began tuning her violin, each note ringing out with mathematical precision that somehow managed to sound both beautiful and cold. She played a brief passage from Paganini's Caprice, No. 24, technically flawless, but delivered with the emotional distance of a surgeon making an incision. "The acoustics are adequate," she pronounced, as if granting a minor favor. "I assume His Holiness will want to say a few words before I perform. Something inspirational about music and faith." Her smile sharpened. "I do hope he won't expect me to pretend this is anything more than a cultural exhibition." Cardinal Torretti felt his stomach tighten. The collision course was now set, and he wondered if Pope Leo XIV truly understood what kind of force was about to meet the immovable object of Vatican tradition. The Paul VI audience hall had transformed as evening descended, its harsh modernist lines softened by carefully positioned lights that cast warm pools across the marble floor. Dignitaries filled the rose cardinals in crimson, ambassadors in tailored suits, journalists with cameras that would beam this cultural experiment to millions around the world. The air hummed with anticipation and barely concealed skepticism. Isabella stood center stage, her black concert dress a stark silhouette against the hall's pale walls. She moved through her pre-performance ritual with the precision of a surgeon preparing for surgery, rosining her bow, adjusting her shoulder rest, running through finger exercises that displayed her technical mastery like a blade being sharpened in public. Each note she played during her warm-up was flawless, yet somehow the music felt as cold as winter moonlight. Then Pope Leo XIV entered, not through the grand processional entrance, but quietly from a side door, moving with the humble dignity that had marked his papacy. He wore simple white robes without ornament, his presence more that of a parish priest than a global religious leader. A few people noticed his arrival and rose respectfully, but the Pope gestured gently for them to remain seated. Isabella saw him approaching and felt a flicker of irritation. She had been hoping to complete her preparation without interruption, especially from someone she viewed as a well-meaning amateur in matters of art. When he walked toward her violin, drawn perhaps by the instrument's obvious beauty and craftsmanship, her professional instincts flared. "Please," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the hall's murmur like a blade. "Don't touch my violin." The words landed with the force of a slap. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Camera operators swiveled toward the stage. Cardinal Toretti half rose from his seat, his face flushing with embarrassment and alarm. Leo XIV paused, his hand still extended toward the instrument. For a moment the hall held its breath. Then he smiled, not the practiced, diplomatic smile of a public figure, but something gentler, more genuine. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "It's a beautiful instrument. The craftsmanship is extraordinary." Isabella's chin lifted slightly, her tone dripping with condescension. "E ten tibai sencha guarneri del Gesù. I'm sure you understand that instruments of this caliber require ... careful handling. Perhaps we should each stick to our own areas of expertise." The silence that followed was electric. Even the Vatican staff, accustomed to diplomatic tensions, shifted uncomfortably. Isabella had just publicly dismissed the Pope as an ignorant amateur in front of the world's media. Pope Leo XIV nodded calmly, his expression unchanged. "Of course, I look forward to hearing you play." But something in his eyes suggested this. Conversation was far from over. The moment Isabella Rossetti lifted her violin to her shoulder, the Paul VI audience hall fell into cathedral silence. Even those who had come expecting a cultural curiosity recognized they were about to witness something extraordinary. Her bow touched the strings, and Paganini's Caprice No. 24 exploded into the air like lightning captured in sound. It was technically flawless, every note precise, every passage executed with the kind of mastery that separated legends from mere virtuosos. Her fingers flew across the fingerboard in passages that had destroyed lesser musicians, her bow dancing through variations that seemed to mock the very concept of human limitation. Yet for all its perfection, the music felt strangely hollow, like a magnificent cathedral built without windows. The audience sat transfixed, caught between admiration and unease. This wasn't just performance, it was demonstration, a display of artistic supremacy that left no room for dialogue or doubt. When the final note faded, the applause was thunderous but somehow tentative, as if the listeners weren't sure whether they had witnessed art or conquest. Isabella lowered her violin and turned toward Pope Leo XIV, who had remained perfectly still throughout her performance. Her smile was sharp as a blade. "Your Holiness," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's perfect acoustics. "I hope that was ... inspirational." Music at this level requires years of dedicated study, countless hours of practice, and a technical understanding that most people simply cannot comprehend. A murmur rippled through the audience. The challenge in her words was unmistakable. "Perhaps," she continued, "you might say a few words about the spiritual significance of what we've just experienced. I'm always curious to hear how those outside the musical world interpret true artistry." Cardinal Toretti gripped his armrest, recognizing the trap being set. Isabella wasn't asking for commentary, she was positioning the Pope as an amateur commenting on matters beyond his understanding. Pope Leo XIV rose slowly from his seat, his movements unhurried despite the weight of global attention. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but carried the quiet authority that had marked his papacy. "That was indeed extraordinary," he said. "Paganini wrote those caprices as studies in technique. But he understood something profound, that difficulty in art isn't an end in itself, but a means to express truths too complex for simpler language." Isabella's eyebrows rose slightly. The Pope's response was more sophisticated than she had expected. "How interesting," she said, her tone now openly challenging. "And what truths do you believe Paganini was expressing, Your Holiness? Assuming, of course, you're familiar with his complete works." The gauntlet was thrown. Isabella Rossetti had just challenged the Pope's musical knowledge in front of the entire world. Pope Leo XIV smiled quietly and stepped toward the stage. Pope Leo XIV approached the stage with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to give. Isabella stepped aside, her smirk suggesting she expected this to be the moment when papal humility would crumble against the reality of technical demands no amount of good intention could overcome. The audience leaned forward, caught between fascination and dread at what might unfold. The Pope asked, gesturing toward her violin with the same gentle reverence he might show a sacred relic. Isabella's laugh was crystalline with condescension. "Your Holiness, this instrument is worth more than most people's homes. Perhaps we should." "Understand," Pope Leo XIV said simply, his hands already moving with the practiced certainty of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. He lifted the Guarneri del Gesù with a familiarity that made Isabella's breath catch. His grip was neither tentative nor overly careful. It was the touch of someone who had held fine instruments before. Then he began to play. The opening notes of Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor flowed into the hall like water, finding its natural course. Not the aggressive virtuosity Isabella had displayed, but something far more profound music that seemed to emerge from the instrument's very soul. His technique was flawless, but it was the interpretation that stole the breath from every throat. In the hall, Isabella's face went white. This wasn't the fumbling of an amateur, or even the competent playing of a talented hobbyist. This was mastery deep, mature, spiritually grounded mastery that spoke of decades of serious study and practice. Cardinal Toretti's mouth fell open. A young seminarian in the back row began to weep quietly. Even the hardened journalist forgot to take notes, caught in the spell of music that transcended mere performance and became prayer made audible. Pope Leo XIV's eyes were half closed as he played, his face bearing the expression of a man lost in worship rather than display. Each phrase was shaped with intention, every note offered not as conquest but as gift. The famous Chaconne movement unfolded with such emotional depth that the brutal modernist hall seemed transformed into a cathedral. When he reached a particularly demanding passage, one that had challenged Isabella herself, his fingers moved across the strings, with an ease that spoke of muscle memory earned through countless hours of practice. This was not luck or divine intervention. This was skill, honed in secret artistry, developed in silence. Mastery hidden beneath papal robes. Isabella stared at him as if seeing a ghost. Her entire worldview, the careful hierarchy she had constructed with herself at the artistic summit, was crumbling with every perfectly executed measure. The Pope played as if he were speaking directly to heaven, and somehow, impossibly, heaven seemed to be listening. When Pope Leo XIV drew the final note from the Guarneri del Gesù and let it fade into the sacred silence of the hall, the world seemed to hold its breath. The violin remained poised beneath his chin for a long moment, as if reluctant to break the connection between instrument and soul. Then, with the same gentle reverence with which he had lifted it, he lowered the violin and extended it toward Isabella. She stood frozen, her face a mask of disbelief that was rapidly cracking into something far more vulnerable. Her hands trembled. As she reached for her instrument, this violin that she had wielded like a weapon, that had been her altar and her god, now returned to her by a man she had sought to humiliate. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the profound quiet. The words seemed torn from some deep place inside her, a place that had been locked away behind years of professional armor and intellectual pride. The audience remained motionless. Cardinals, who had witnessed papal elections and world-changing moments, sat in stunned recognition that they had just experienced something equally historic. Not a political moment or diplomatic triumph, but a revelation of grace so unexpected that it defied every category they possessed for understanding papal behavior. Pope Leo XIV's eyes met Isabella's with infinite gentleness. "Music has been my companion since childhood," he said quietly. "My father taught me that beauty belongs to everyone, but it serves best when offered freely." Isabella's breath came in short gasps. Everything she had built her identity upon her. Supremacy, her intellectual superiority, her comfortable atheism lay in ruins around her feet. "You let me mock you," she said, her voice breaking. "You let me treat you like an ignorant amateur, and all this time, I was simply waiting to share something beautiful with you," the Pope replied. "That's what music teaches us: how to wait, how to listen, how to receive gifts we didn't know we needed." A tear slipped down Isabella's cheek, followed by another. In the third row, a renowned music critic removed her glasses and wiped her own eyes. Behind the cameras, technicians who had come expecting to document a cultural event found themselves witnessing something that felt like the beginning of a conversion. "I don't know what I believe anymore," Isabella whispered, her words barely carrying beyond the stage. Pope Leo XIV stepped closer, his voice gentle as a blessing. "That's where faith begins, not in certainty, but in questions too beautiful for pride to answer alone." The silence that followed was not empty, but full, pregnant with the possibility of transformation that no one, least of all, Isabella, had seen coming. The small chapel tucked away in the Vatican gardens had been built. For quiet contemplation, its stone walls worn smooth by centuries of prayers whispered in darkness. Isabella found herself there without conscious decision. Drawn perhaps by an instinct, she didn't understand the need for silence. After having her entire world shattered by 6 minutes of Bach, she sat in the back pew, still wearing her black concert dress, her violin case resting beside her like a faithful companion that had somehow become a stranger. The chapel's single stained glass window cast fragments of colored light across the floor, creating patterns that shifted with the evening breeze outside. "I've spent my entire life believing in nothing," she whispered to the empty air, her voice echoing softly off the ancient stones. "How do you lose faith in faithlessness?" Her hands, which had commanded standing ovations from the world's most demanding audiences, now trembled in her lap. The certainties that had anchored her that art was humanity's highest achievement, that talent was its own justification, that religious faith was intellectual weakness had been swept away by the impossible reality of what she had witnessed. Footsteps on stone announced another presence before Pope Leo XIV appeared in the chapel doorway. He didn't enter immediately, instead pausing to ask quietly, "May I join you?" Isabella nodded, not trusting her voice. He sat several pews ahead of her, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid overwhelming her with authority or expectation. "I've been sitting here for an hour," she said finally, "trying to reconstruct my understanding of the world. It's ... more difficult than I expected." Pope Leo XIV turned slightly toward her, his profile gentle in the colored light. "I spent 3 years in the mountains of Bolivia, questioning everything I thought I knew about God. Sometimes the questions are more sacred than the answers." "But you had faith to begin with," Isabella said. "I built my entire identity on the absence of it. Music was my religion. Technique was my scripture. Applause was my prayer. And tonight, you showed me that even in that realm, my realm, there are depths I've never touched." "The music you played was beautiful," the Pope said gently. "Technical mastery in service of beauty is never wasted, even when the heart hasn't yet learned to surrender." Isabella's laugh was bitter but not unkind. "Surrender. The one thing I've never been able to do." She paused, staring at the altar's simple cross. "When you played tonight, it wasn't just music. It was like the violin was praying through your hands." "Perhaps," Pope Leo XIV said softly, "it was praying through yours too, and you simply hadn't learned to recognize the language yet." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with possibility. 6 months after the night that changed everything, Isabella Rossetti found herself in a place she never could have imagined, a modest music school in the Trastevere district of Rome. teaching violin to children whose families could never afford concert tickets, let alone private lessons with world-renowned. The room was cramped and poorly lit, filled with mismatched chairs and instruments that had seen better decades. Yet when 8-year-old Marco struggled through his first tentative bow strokes, producing sounds that would have made her wince, in her former life, Isabella felt something she had never experienced in any concert hall: pure, uncomplicated joy. "Don't worry about the squeaks," she told him gently, adjusting his grip. Even the greatest violins sang imperfectly when they were learning their voice. Her correspondence with Pope Leo XIV had become a lifeline during the difficult months of questioning and rebuilding. His letters arrived weekly, never pressuring but always offering wisdom wrapped in understanding. "Service," he had written in his most recent letter, "is not about diminishing our gifts, but about discovering their true purpose. When we play for applause, we perform. When we play for love, we pray." The transformation hadn't been sudden or dramatic. The lucrative concert contracts gradually gave way to teaching engagements. The luxury penthouse was exchanged for a simple apartment near the music school. The designer gowns and 5-star hotels were replaced by comfortable clothes and quiet evenings spent preparing lessons for students who looked at her with wonder, not because of her fame, but because she had taken time to notice their struggles. Signorina Isabella called Maria, a shy 12-year-old whose family worked in the nearby market. "Can you play the piece again? The one that sounds like angels?" Isabella smiled and lifted her violin, the same Guarneri del Gesù that had once been her weapon of artistic superiority. Now it felt different in her hands, lighter somehow, as if it had been freed from the burden of proving anything. She began to play Bach's air on the G string, the melody that Pope Leo XIV had once described as music that teaches us how to breathe with heaven. As the notes filled the cramped room, Isabella watched her students' faces transform. Some closed their eyes, others swayed gently, and little Marco stopped struggling with his own instrument to simply listen. This was what she had been missing in all those glittering concert halls. The intimate communion between music and souls, ready to receive it. Her phone buzzed with a message from her former agent, Vienna Philharmonic, asking about availability. The fee would be extraordinary. Isabella looked at her students, then quietly turned off her phone. Some invitations, she had learned, were worth declining. The real music was happening right here, 1 year after her world had been turned upside down by 6 minutes of Bach. Isabella Rossetti stood in the same small Vatican chapel where her transformation had begun, but she was no longer alone. 23 children from Rome's orphanages sat in the ancient pews, their faces bright with anticipation, clutching violins that ranged from student instruments to donations from Isabella's former colleagues who had heard about her unexpected new calling. The morning light filtered through the stained glass window in patterns of gold and azure, casting the same colored shadows that had witnessed her first tentative questions about faith. But where she had once sat in confusion and despair, the chapel now resonated with the barely contained energy of young musicians preparing for their first formal concert. Pope Leo XIV entered quietly, as was his way, taking a seat in the back row among the children rather than in any position of prominence. Isabella caught his eye and smiled, not the practiced, camera-ready expression of her former life, but something genuine and unguarded. In his answering nod, she saw the quiet satisfaction of a shepherd who had watched a lost sheep not only return to the fold, but become a guide for others. "Are you nervous, Signorina Isabella?" asked Sophia, a 10-year-old whose family had fled Syria 3 years earlier. The girl's violin was second-hand and slightly battered, but she held it with the same reverence Isabella had once reserved for her Guarneri del Gesù. "Nervous? No," Isabella replied, adjusting Sophia's bow hold with gentle precision. "But excited? Absolutely. Today we're not performing for applause. We're sharing what we've learned about making something beautiful together." The children had prepared a simple program, Bach's Gesù, Joy of Man's Desiring, arranged for multiple violins, followed by a piece Isabella had composed herself, Song for New Beginnings, that wove together melodies simple enough for beginners, yet rich enough to showcase the profound truth that music's power lay not in complexity, but in sincerity. As the first notes of the Bach began, Isabella felt a familiar peace settle over her. These children would never headline at La Scala or command 6-figure fees, but their music carried something her former performances had often lacked: joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy in the act of creation itself. Little Marco, now 9 and far more confident than the squeaky beginner she had first met, took a brief solo passage. His technique was imperfect, his intonation occasionally uncertain, but his face glowed with the wonder of making something beautiful with his own hands. In the back, Pope Leo XIV closed his eyes and listened with the same reverent attention he had once given to Isabella's technically flawless but spiritually empty performance. When they reached Isabella's original composition, she stepped forward to join them, her Guarneri singing in harmony with their student instruments. The piece told the story of her own journey: discord resolving into harmony, pride melting into service, performance transforming into prayer. The children played their hearts out, and in their enthusiasm, Isabella heard echoes of every lesson Pope Leo XIV had tried to teach her about grace as the final note faded into the chapel's ancient stones. The applause that followed was unlike any Isabella had ever received. It wasn't the thunderous ovation of concert halls, but the warm, grateful appreciation of souls who had been touched by beauty offered freely. Pope Leo XIV stood and joined the children in their enthusiastic clapping, his eyes bright with tears of joy. "Thank you," he said simply, as the children gathered around Isabella, chattering excitedly about their performance, "for showing us that the most powerful concerts are often the smallest ones." Isabella looked around the chapel at the children whose lives had been enriched by music, at the Pope whose gentle wisdom had saved her from the prison of her own pride, at the colored light still dancing on ancient stones. The morning when she had first challenged Pope Leo XIV seemed like another lifetime, another person entirely. Outside, the bells of St. Peter's began to chime, calling the faithful to prayer. But in this small chapel, prayer had already happened, not in words, but in music. Not in performance, but in the offering of gifts, freely given and gratefully received. The woman who had once mocked the power of faith now understood its deepest truth, that grace, like music, was most beautiful when it served something greater than itself.